How often should players roll their dice for skills? Should it happen all the time, or should it mainly be the things that they describe they're doing? Let's look at how that impacts the game and especially engagement. If we look at older versions of D&D, like this Temple of Elemental Evil that recently Sean and I covered on Mastering Dungeons, it's full of, by the way, look at my super highlight written on copy from back in the day. It's full of situations that are really interesting, but there were no skills back then in the game. And in fact, many of today's games that are lighter, simpler kinds of games don't have any skills at all. The characters just don't have a skill system. And other RPGs do have skills, but do them in very different ways. And all of that impacts play. And if you play lots of these games, you probably at some point have to think to yourself, how do I feel as DM or player with how often we are rolling dice at the table to resolve these sort of skill situations? So I'm looking here at this part of Temple of Elemental Evil called Hexagonal Room, and it says the following. A partially destroyed stone chair dominates this place. It is hewn of brown marble veined with black and stands near the middle of the north wall. Both arms have been broken off and the seat is chipped. A piece is missing from the back, and the whole is fractured. Rubble and broken furniture are strewn about the room. The ceiling overhead is at least 35 feet high, possibly more, lost in the shadows of the supporting arches. The stench of rotting flesh faintly lingers throughout the area. And that's a really interesting one because what's really going on here is there are 18 sturges in the ceiling, which is really rough for AD&D, and at this point in the characters' careers. It says that they're 90% undetectable until they attack, 50% chance of surprise unless someone does notice them, or unless you do something to keep a lookout, looking upwards. And then in the ground, you've got bones. I guess that's the rotting smell, unclear. There are copper pieces to be found, a cool magic item, and then there's a secret door that we don't know anything about. If you listened to that earlier description and followed some of it, there was a lot there. A lot of it had nothing. Like the chair that's so carefully described at the beginning, there's nothing really there at all. Let's take it another look, this time at Shadowdark. So Shadowdark's Horde of the Sea Wolf King, which I ran a while back, it has this stingbat cave. So sturge-like monster. Tarry black mud splatters the ground. The occasional leathery rustle emanates from the shadowy ceiling. Okay? So the good news, we're not distracted by all that chair business and whatever, but there are stingbats. 4 red dog-sized stingbats with long nose beaks roost upside down along the ceiling. This is DM information, not things we'd read out or talk about. Light disturbs them, but they remain asleep if left in darkness. And then there's the mud. This is really coppery smelling stingbat guano. And if you move through it at more than half speed, you might slip and fall, which of course can affect the combat if it happens. You know, here in this approach, right, and we are deliberately leaving a lot open and a lot for the DM to adjudicate. What will happen as the characters enter this room and you just give it whatever description? You might read that out loud, or you might paraphrase it or add to it. They might investigate the mud, poke at it. They might think about that leathery rustle that they hear if you describe it. But there are no skill checks. So it's really entirely about what the characters and their players describe they are doing. And we can think about whether the presence or lack of skills impacts play here, right? I think especially in the previous example with Temple of Elemental Evil, which is an older design, still amazing, right? There's a lot there that is sort of distracting, maybe on purpose. Older editions sometimes had a lot of gotchas to them. And it seems to suggest that it's very hard for the players to realize that there are these sturges up above. Here, the very description of this leathery rustling prompts you to think that maybe we should be asking questions as to what's up there. Now, what might happen is you go, well, let's bring a light source so we can see what's up there. That activates them. So maybe it is a gotcha here as well. But there is a lot of play here to be had. What there isn't in both situations is a skill check that would tell you something automatically. It's up to you to bring things up and describe and see what that outcome is. No skills, interesting situations. It's all about what your character does, and that's supposed to drive emerging play. A lot of role-playing games have this built in some way, even if they have skills. Like below, there's that image of aliens. A lot of times in the Alien RPG, there is a situation that's very interesting, like having to repair something and you do the spacewalk and you're trying to open that door, but then maybe it's stuck or there's slime on it, right? And you as a player have to decide what you want to do because you've got this task to fix this thing, but there's some sign of tampering or some problem. Well, what do you do, right? Those decisions are still really important. And then you also have a skill system on top of that. So what about 5th edition? 5e D&D definitely has made a move forward with how it uses skills, or let's say a move towards embracing skills, something that started 3rd edition, and even older editions had a number of proficiencies and other capabilities that were added. There was the way the thief class worked. There were, in basic, we had various skill analogs. Alternity really added the idea of skills and skill ranks. That 3rd edition then learned from how the Alternity was designed, added this idea. It became, we'll talk a little bit about why, but skills became a really big part of the game starting in 3rd edition, and that has just proceeded onwards. And if we look at 5th edition, we can see that 5th edition is really leaning into skills as part of play. We can see that in the 2024 version, where the rules are using it in the examples of play as a main driver of interaction between player and DM. So this is the player's handbook right there in chapter 1, where it walks through how to play the game, and it reads some box text based on sort of Ravenloft, and you're looking at these gargoyles high on the walls, and a bunch of players say, "Ooh, I want to ask about this. I want to know about this. What's going on?" And the GM says, "Okay, Philip, let's take one at a time. Philip Gareth's looking at the gargoyles. Make an intelligence check. Does my investigation skill apply? Sure. A 7. They look like decorations to you. Maeve, Mirabella is examining the drawbridge, right? And then things continue. And if we go further down, we see more examples of this as we get into the types of situations that are taking place. So social interaction, for example, you are speaking to someone and you start to, the player Philip says, I watch his reaction as he reads this letter. And so he reaches for the letter and make a wisdom insight check, right, to get a read on this person. I got an 18. Okay, you notice that they're trying to conceal their terror. He's afraid to even touch the letter seal, right? So information is coming specifically from that die roll, but it's adjudicated, right? In this case, we can see that this isn't something like in the adventure, you've got to get a 16 or higher for this. This is a judgment call. And the information says the DM set it at 15 when a roll was called for, but it's not like in the adventure text, right? This is just something that's being done as a sort of adjudication. We can also see this in the exploration example. We get an example of play that comes here in this example. And we see a number of cases where they're trying to do things, interacting. And when it finally goes to, let's see, what is it that Philip asks for? How old does the painting look? Make me an intelligence history check as Gareth looks at the painting. Philip rolls, a 20. And so then here are 2 bits of information that you learn based on looking at that painting. And that includes how old it is and what's going on with this woman and so on. And so that goes on into the interaction. And then there's more later that happens as well in this example of play, right? Rolls to open a door and things like that are pretty obvious and expected. So let's take a step back and ask, why were skills added to D&D and what is the point of them in modern games? Skills were added for a couple of different reasons. Part of it was a love for complexity and characters, but what's behind that is an idea about showing expertise, that players could show that they are particularly good at something and develop their character, right? Distinguish one character from another. My fighter is good at this. Your fighter is good at that. And we get to tell the story of who we are, right? I'm a ranger who really cares about tracking. Why? Because of this backstory thing or this way of looking at the world, whatever it might be. And so when we are a DM in this kind of a game, it's good to stop and think about, are we doing what is expected by players and by the game in terms of expertise and developing characters, right? Are we helping the ranger feel like an expert in the outdoors? Is the wizard coming off like they're an expert in arcane matters? last video, I talked about that idea of people just sort of shouting out ideas like, oh, I want to check blah. And then someone else starts rolling. And one of the reasons to kind of control that and slow down that pace and establish a better way for your group to work with skill rolling and work together is for this. So that you can say, are you sure you're all starting to act like you're rolling dice? Can we maybe pause here? You came up with the idea. Now you also know that, while that's a great idea to look for tracks, if you start moving around this area, you might also obscure some tracks in the process if you roll really low. You do have your friend the ranger who loves, their whole backstory is about this, right? And so we can say, whether it's at a meta level, and I think actually a meta level is better, right? Out of character, we can address this and help players see like, oh yeah, I want to do this, or no, actually my character kind of does this, and then I'll be prepared to apologize and do it not only because my character did it this way, hopefully, but in a way that is sort of interesting. Like, oh no, I obscured the tracks. I'm so sorry. I was mistaken. My character's going to learn and develop from this, right? It can be fun to have those kinds of interactions, but you are thinking about it as a player. You're not just blurting it out because we're playing a game. This is it's not Monopoly, right? And so we can also look at things like class. We can look at backstory, right? Maybe the cleric, their backstory, they told us about how they rallied a small town to oppose an enemy. The fighter, whom we might associate with sort of martial actions and soldiery and whatever, well, they were a street urchin. And in a situation where there is a town and we have to rally villagers for an upcoming fight, it is actually the cleric that is most fitting for that. And it's good for us to know about our characters. If you follow Mike Shea in his 8 steps, right, we want to understand our characters, know what kind of things they are related to, which aren't always what the class would drive us towards. So backstory matters, and that's an opportunity to think about with skills. We can also think about things like what the class or backstory link to in spite of the rule system. And what I mean about this is something like a really fierce warrior that has to make that charisma intimidation check. Maybe we should allow strength or some other ability, right? The cleric that has a very low intelligence skill, but really is constantly researching gods, should probably be able to use wisdom for their religion checks, right? When it's that sort of knowledge. Intelligence, nature, also sometimes it makes sense to have wisdom, and sometimes it makes sense as intelligence. So you can think through when to allow the better stat to be used, or are we trying to overcome it by allowing for advantage, or just saying, nope, that's the way it is, right? It's useful to think about this and think through how the game is and play is asking us to consider the characters when we are making skill checks, right? Adjudicating that as part of play. You can see a little bit of that in the 5th edition, even if it doesn't give you all these examples. Another reason why we added skills to games is because skills can help establish a common way to interact between the players and the DM, and also between the designer and the players and the DM. If you think back on that Temple of Elemental Evil example with these sturges, right? What is going on here, right? Is the point to gotcha, right? Like, is the point to distract the players so they experience the sturges coming down on them and surprising them, right? It's a little unclear based on the way it's written. We don't really know. So when we see something like a DC for a skill check, we know that that interaction is expected, right? It takes an X skill at Y result to hear the leathery rustling of the sturges or stingbats up above. That now lets us know this is an expected interaction and what to use, right? It codifies it a bit more. And I know some of you are thinking like, but then it's like baby steps or handholding. Sure, there's still a lot for the game to be added there, right? And we can still make it very important to ask what you are doing and take that into account. But that is why one of the reasons skills have been added to the game is to create that baseline interaction, that baseline knowledge and conversation. So if we know that tracking uses some type of wilderness or survival skill, whenever we need to find tracks, players and DM, designer, we're all on the same page as to what is expected to kick in. And using that language, it's a common language, right? That we all understand. Oh, sure. You want to track? Make me, your survival check. And, because of your backstory, I'm going to give you advantage, right? All of those parameters are known and understood. And so it is easy to work with. And each edition has a slight variation on what we might use, or each role-playing game, right? The Free League games often use a combination of a characteristic, another part of your character build, and then it uses like a bonus for equipment, and you're adding dice or changing the number of dice that the number or size of dice based on your abilities, the tools you use, the situation you have, whether someone's helping you. That all adds more dice that you roll, and those dice create the chance that you will get a result that succeeds, right? So, and in D&D, we have things like whether it's diplomacy and streetwise as your skills, or is it persuasion that you use, right? Is endurance a skill, for example, as it was in 4th edition, right? These changes across editions kind of change that granularity and that communication, and it's sort of fun to see how that impacts play. In the game Night's Black Agents, and this is an example character sheet here, we can see that characters have different types of abilities. This becomes very obvious if you know the game, but the character sheet sort of hints at it in some ways. We have some different abilities here that are investigative abilities. And then if we scroll over to the side, we have general abilities. General abilities are things like athletics or disguise, explosive devices, hand-to-hand combat, shooting. And when we're doing something like that, usually the threshold we need for success is a 4 on a d6. So we're rolling that d6. If we get a 4 or better, we succeed. Well, we can buy success by crossing off these circles that we have. Those circles are basically our skill ranks. And so you can see we have 8 in athletics. So I'm trying to leap, into a car that we're driving next to, and I want to leap in there. Gabriella can roll that d6, and on a 4 better succeed. But usually that could be different. But usually that is a 4. And I could say, even if I roll a 1, I want to succeed. So I'm going to mark off 3 points on my athletics to add it to the die roll. Now, even if I roll a 1, I get a 4 and I succeed. So we can buy success in that sense, right? Very different type of game. Another huge difference is these investigative abilities always work. That's why you don't have a lot of ranks here. And what the ranks do, these little circles, is the ability to really specialize and do amazing things. So, for example, if I have flirting on here, that is a thing that I'm good at, and I can just do that whenever I need to do it, and it pretty much succeeds. But what I can do with my flirting is spend that box and really establish something. Maybe I want this NPC to continue to be interested in me beyond this scene, right? Or I want to really uncover things that are deep secrets beyond the knowledge I'm trying to get, right? Something special. An example of this is, let's say I had forensics. Now, this character does not, but if I did, and I'm examining a body, I know, because I have that skill, I will know how that person was killed, right? I will know the cause of death. I will know what they suffered from about them because I'm a skilled forensics person. I have it on my list. If I spend that circle, I'm saying to the GM, hey, I'm so interested in this scene that if there's special stuff, I want you to give it to me. And that's what that spend means, right? So it's very interesting to see those huge differences in how the game is approached by different RPGs with related to the relation of skills, right? And we can think about that in our approach for any RPG, right? If we're running Aliens, to what extent do we just want some information to be absolutely imparted upon you? To what extent is it based on the approach and the questions you're asking? And to what extent is it based on a die roll, right? Last video, I also talked about Draw Steal and how Draw Steal said, hey, don't call for a roll unless the situation is interesting, like we care about success or failure, and it's going to be dramatic, and it's actually a challenge, right? So if you're just jumping over a wall, if nothing's going on, we actually don't even care if you fail. Like, we're probably not going to give you damage, so it's just, do you succeed or not? You'll eventually do it. So let's skip that part and get to the interesting part, which is, what do you do with the knowledge, right? What do you do with the fact that you jumped over the wall into the noble's estate? That's the interesting part. Let's get there. Night's Black Agents very similarly says, let's skip over whether you can figure out what the body, how the body came to be dead, and let's get to what you want to do with that information. That's the interesting part, right? How do you take that and, say, frame somebody or use it in the next scene? That's the interesting part. And what that forces us to do as GMs is create more interesting adventures, because it's not just, do you flirt with someone It's what do you do with the ability that you've created, maybe a relationship with this NPC in some way? How does that play out over time? That's where the fun is, right? We're moving that fun to another level. Other games have the idea that when you make a skill check, you can succeed with a complication, even though you succeeded, or you fail with some sort of advantage, right? So it's this idea of a setback or an advantage coming into play despite the results of the dice, right? This often happens. We have multiple dice or some total that we need where there's success and then success with advantage, or failure, but then there's failure with a complication. So that can all happen depending on the game and how that takes place. And this also makes play very interesting, but it calls on us as the DM or GM to do a lot of adjudication. But it's a really neat idea, and you'll see how I use this in a bit. But it's worth thinking about what success and failure mean in your game or games. Sometimes it's really cut and dry, right? We can have skill checks that say, okay, you're trying to jump across the pit. So that is a question of just, did you make it or not? We could even put a little bit of granularity there, right? Failing by less than 5 means you grab the edge of the pit. Otherwise, you fall to the pit, you take the falling damage, you're prone, right? All of that usual stuff. But it's fairly cut and dry. Other times it makes sense to adjudicate on the fly, particularly when we're trying to learn something, right? Think back on that Sturge or Stingbat scenario. Is the goal of the encounter a pass-fail? So I say to the GM playing a 5e version of Temple of Mental Evil, I'm interested in that strange chair you described, but before I look at the stone chair, up above, do I see anything, like when I look at the shadowy ceiling, right? Or I might even say, before we disturb the room, I just want to look and see if anything looks out of place. I'm not even mentioning the ceiling, right? So these are different types of questions we get from players, and we want to adjudicate on the fly how much information to give out where the adventure didn't provide it, right? And that's actually a really fun thing to do. We can do things like use the cutoffs for easy, medium, hard that are in the player's handbook to adjudicate the situation. We also can innately just think about the number range on a D20, right? We know the difference between getting, a 1 on a D20 and getting that 20 or a 16 or 19, right? We can understand innately what that's like. We know a 4 is really low. We know a 10 is average. And so taking into account various things like what the character's doing, who the character is, what has been happening in the adventure so far, right? Maybe they are so beat up that really narratively, play is going to be a lot more fun if they think about how to get through this room without disturbing the Sturges than being waylaid and ambushed by the Sturges. And any number of other factors can all be brought into that. And we can say, okay, based on this, give me a roll. And you might be thinking in your mind, as in the example that we saw for the 5th edition, okay, if they get a 15 or higher or a 12 or higher, or whatever it is that we decide, then I'll give out information. And in fact, what information we give can even be a scale, right? That we decide, adjudicate at the moment. So, maybe a 10 gives you some information. A 12, really kind of everything you need for the decision. And a 14 on up, we're all good. You know exactly what's going on, right? You can tier it in some way, and it can be off the cuff, right? That is okay. There doesn't have to be a truth to the adventure. Often there is no truth to the adventure, right? I cannot look at this Temple of Elemental Evil write-up and know exactly what it was expected, or even the Shadowdark scenario. I can make guesses as a designer as to what both are intending, which are different, but I don't know. And even if it was written up, I don't know whether the person that wrote the adventure, and I can say this as an adventure designer, if you look at a particular adventure and say, Teos, when you wrote that, were you intending this to be as hard as it is? I might say to you, I don't know. I wrote that at a time that, these were the things that were going on in my head and I was dealing with. And so, that might not be, I would just run it the way you think you should run it, because I could have had a lot on my mind and I may not have intended for that the way it came out, right? Or maybe I did, and it's fine. Either way, you adjudicating makes sense. And as an adventure designer, I can tell you there is no truth to the written adventure that should supersede the fun at your table. All right, so let's get into the heart of this, which is how often should players roll? And there is a lot of variance between DMs on this. And there's no right answer other than for you, right? And I would hope that if you're watching this, you agree that what you like is what you like. Doesn't mean everybody needs to play it that way, right? You might favor rolling less and focusing on what the character is doing. That's clearly what Shadowdark is going for, right? And even in games that have rolls, often they want to save rolls for the most dramatic moments, making that leap across the pit and seeing whether you make it. That's what it's there for. The rest of the time, give out information freely and focus on what they do with it, right? That is totally a fine way to do it. You might say that Shadowdark is genius because it takes us back to those days of really thinking through what is it that happens when I describe what I'm doing and you tell me what's going on. And that's the sole way to adjudicate things. But you might also favor rolling more often. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons to consider rolling more often than you might expect. Dice results give us an input, right? In that idea of assessing what are the sting bats or the sturges doing up, or do I even see them? How to deal with them, right? Do they like light or not? Any of those questions. The roll of the die can really tell us, whatever shape it is. We might say, well, okay, you got a 12. And based on all those different factors I mentioned, you now make that adjudication combined with what they tell us they're doing. And this is, let's pause and say this, right? You want players at your table telling you what they're doing, not just rolling. And players, if you're watching this, don't just roll dice. Don't just say, I make a perception check, I got a 15, right? Tell me what you're doing. Tell me what you're interested in. Know that your player, your DM, is not trying to punish you. So if you say, I'm particularly interested in all the refuse on the ground, that doesn't have to mean you don't see things up top, right? It can be part of the equation the DM uses, but at the same time, it could help you, right? There could have been something hidden in the ground. And so if you're particularly focused on that, that might help you, might even give you advantage. You never know. But it's important that your character declare what you're doing. When the players are doing that and they're saying, okay, I'm examining this, I'm interested in this, I'm thinking about it, they're also doing a dialogue with the other players, and they may have ideas. Again, we want to prevent just everybody suddenly rolling dice, but we want that player to roll the dice. And rolling dice is fun. That's one of the reasons that we want people, or may consider wanting people rolling dice more often, is because, hey, it's just fun to see what the math rock creates, right? Rolling dice focuses the moment, for sure, for that player, but even for other players, it creates drama. What will happen, right? We automatically sort of leap into that sort of mentality of, oh, odds, risk, probability. We want to see what happens, and oh, I just roll a 20, like that. See, I was interested. And rolling dice grabs attention. It helps the other players focus in a way they might not have, because maybe they're just focused on only checking the chair, and someone else is interested in the ceiling, right? When they make that roll, suddenly everybody just kind of turns and they want to see, okay, yeah, what is the result? What do they roll? How do they, what is the outcome? Dice can also help overcome a gap in player knowledge. Maybe they weren't super listening when we described the ceiling being covered in shadows, and they just focus on that mud or the refuse. And they might have skipped the part that you talked about leathery wings in that description from Shadowdark. So that die roll can be something we use to fill in the gaps as DM, director, GM, because we know the characters should have heard that, right? It can happen when, someone's negotiating with a merchant and we explained a thing, but they didn't pick up on it. That die roll, we suddenly reinforce it. Or you're examining the mud, but you're alert enough and experienced enough at delving that, hey, you can't help but wonder about that shadowy ceiling. And in fact, you hear something. A nature check could tell you more. Right? That's the kind of thing that the result could give you. The mud is fine. There's nothing there. That's what you asked about. But your roll was so good that, hey, you know what? Something is moving around in the ceiling. You can't see it. And if you were a skilled person at nature, you might be able to figure it out. So then that's where we can bring in more players, right? Which is also fun. Again, keeps that attention going that started with the die roll, leads to maybe asking the ranger type person, hey, can you hear it? And they make that check and they go, oh, that's the sound of a sting bat, right? Like we want to, and you know what? I happen to know because I rolled so high that there is, if we bring the torch up towards them, they will just attack us. They're going to go nuts. We don't want that. So we can build that narrative based on all the skills that were rolled, and rolling a lot can actually be interesting across the whole party, right? Adding to the narrative. And in some cases, it won't, right? Some cases we will say, you failed. And an outcome is now needed, combat, for example. But it's useful. And when only some progress is made, it's just that natural link so that players can jump in and help, right? You failed at the nature check, but wizard, make me an arcana check. Hey, you know what? The mud is actually guano. You know that because it's famous that you make fireballs out of. That's one of the components for guanos. Guano is one of the components for fireball spell. Everybody knows that. You studied that in arcane school. And then that creates more information, especially if you're thinking, I really don't want to have a stingbat fight. I'd rather see whether they can escape here, especially because they're so hurt and whatever else might be going in the adventure. You can make that sort of call. So dice rolling can be part of that adjudication as well. Drama and excitement can be a bit higher when it feels attainable because of a die roll, right? The die roll creates the expectation that there is a possibility of an outcome or possibilities. And so rolling and getting low or high gives us information. I didn't learn everything that can be learned, right? I studied the painting or the murals and I rolled low, so I don't know a whole lot. Maybe that's something I want to ask others about, right? Versus if I just explain it, you might not quite pick up on that in the same way. And again, this is not exclusive. It's not that there's no other way around this, but it's just something that the die roll can really draw the player's attention to that, especially if they weren't paying such close attention. The outcome of the die roll is often something they look at, right? And we can feel like there's less of a gotcha element. There can be more of this trust of the die. The die establishes the reality rather than something being preordained or set up to fail. You know that you made that roll and what you got based on it. So there you have it. Special thanks to channel members who have given me questions that led to this series of shows on skills. So please do leave me your questions and your comments as to how you use skills or other parts of the game. And huge thanks to those who are members of my Patreon. Your support is absolutely important to me, keeps this channel alive. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.